Late June 1863, the Confederate States of America believed at last that the war might soon be won. Robert Edward Lee, fresh from his dazzling triumph at Chancellorsville, had convinced President Jefferson Davis that the moment had come to carry the fight onto northern soil. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington itself, those cities trembled on his maps like ripe fruit. On the 28th of June, the Union Army of the Potomac received a new commander, George Gordon Meade, a Philadelphian engineer with a short temper and a long sense of duty, took the reins at midnight. He was ordered to find Lee, strike him, and above all, keep the capital safe. Between these two armies lay the Cumberland Valley, quilted with ripening wheat and peach orchards heavy with fruit. Gettysburg, a market town of 2,400 souls, sat where 10 roads met like spokes on a wheel. Farmers noticed first long columns of grey-clad soldiers clogging the dusty Chambersburg pike. Shopkeepers shuttered windows. Seminary students from Lutheran College peered nervously toward Seminary Ridge. Lee's army stretched 40 miles from the Potomac to the Susquehanna. James Longstreet, his most trusted lieutenant, urged caution. "We should move between Meade and Washington." Longstreet whispered, "Force the Federals to attack us on ground of our choosing." Lee listened, but victory had made him bold. Northward, Meade's columns pounded the macadam roads of Maryland. Winfield Scott Hancock, the tall, charismatic commander of the Second Corps, rode ahead to scout. "General," an aide shouted above the drum of hoofs, "scouts report rebels concentrating near Gettysburg." Hancock nodded grimly. The hinge of fate was turning toward those quiet ridges. On the 30th of June, Gettysburg's citizens felt the first tremor. John Burns, the town constable and veteran of the War of 1812, loaded his musket. Jenny Wade, 20 years old, carried water to thirsty soldiers and wondered if tomorrow would still smell of peach blossoms or powder smoke. Neither army had intended to fight here, yet the roads, the rivers, the very lay of the land conspired to gather them. By dawn on July 1st, the storm that had been gathering for weeks would finally break. The first pale fingers of dawn crept over the Pennsylvania hills on July 1st, touching the dew-wet fields outside Gettysburg, where two armies would soon collide. Neither side had chosen this ground, yet destiny had chosen it for them. At 7 in the morning, Confederate General Henry Heth's division stepped off the dusty Cashtown Road, their worn boots raising clouds of Pennsylvania soil. Heth had heard rumors of shoes stockpiled in Gettysburg, and his men desperately needed them after weeks of hard marching. What he found instead would become one of history's bloodiest battlefields. 2 miles ahead, Union Brigadier General John Buford watched through field glasses from McPherson Ridge. His 2 brigades of dismounted cavalry, carbines loaded and ready, lay hidden in the ridge's natural folds. Buford knew his 3,000 troopers couldn't stop Lee's army, but he could delay them long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The first shots cracked across the morning stillness at 7:30. Buford's carbines answered with deadly precision, their breech-loading repeaters pouring fire into Heth's advancing gray line. For 3 desperate hours, the dismounted troopers held the ridge, buying precious time with blood and courage. By 10 o'clock, the thunder of approaching Union artillery echoed from the south. Major General John Reynolds rode ahead of his First Corps, his face grim as he took in the desperate situation. Without hesitation, he ordered his infantry forward to relieve Buford's exhausted cavalry. The Iron Brigade, tough veterans from Wisconsin and Indiana, marched double time toward the sound of firing. Their reputation preceded them, and Heth's men knew the fight had just intensified. Then came the moment that would echo through American history. As Reynolds directed his troops into position near the railroad cut, a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet found its mark. The ball struck Reynolds in the neck, killing him instantly. His body crumpled to the ground as his staff watched in horror, the first of many commanders who would fall in the days ahead. By noon, The fighting had spilled into Gettysburg's streets. Union forces, outnumbered and pressed on three sides, began a fighting retreat through the town's brick-lined avenues. As evening approached, Lee's army controlled Gettysburg, but the day's victory felt hollow. The Union army had not been destroyed. It had been pushed, yes, but it had fallen back to commanding heights south of town. Throughout the night, both armies reinforced their positions. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the long Fishhook Ridge became the Union's fortress. Lee rode through the darkness, assessing the ground his men had won. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow would bring the decisive blow. As exhausted soldiers from both sides collapsed beside their weapons, Gettysburg lay quiet, save for the groans of the wounded. The storm had only begun, and the worst was yet to come. Night settled over Seminary Ridge like a shroud, its black folds broken only by the orange tremble of 1,000 campfires. Robert Edward Lee dismounted near the fringe of those fires, boots sinking into Pennsylvania soil that had never known war until today. His pale eyes, red-rimmed from road dust and sleepless hours, scanned the luminous crests opposite him, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, the round tops, now pricked with Union watchfires like hostile constellations. Lieutenant General James Longstreet approached, cloak swirling, his heavy beard silvered by moonlight. Together they bent over a crumpled map spread across a drumhead, its corners weighted by pistol butts. Scouts had returned with bleak news. The Federals were digging in along a fishhook arc 3 miles long, artillery already emplaced on the commanding heights. Lee listened, knuckles whitening on the brim of his weather-beaten hat. "The enemy is there," he murmured, gesturing toward the dark ridgeline, "and I am going to attack him there." Longstreet's reply was a low rumble of caution, urging a flanking march south to interpose the army between Meade and Washington. Lee shook his head. "No," he said softly, "the enemy is too strong to turn. We must break his line before more of his people arrive." A courier brought fresh intelligence. Union reinforcements were hurrying through the night from Taneytown and Westminster. Time, always time, was bleeding away. Lee traced the map with a gloved finger. Both flanks at once, he decided. Ewell on the right, Longstreet on the left. Crush them before dawn. Across the shallow valley, on Cemetery Ridge, Major General George Gordon Meade had arrived only hours earlier, stiff from a midnight ride. He found his army clinging to a ridge like men to a raft in a storm. Brigadier General Winfield Scott Hancock rode the line, voice hoarse, urging every man to dig, pile stones, cut branches for headlogs. "Dig, boys, dig like your lives depend on it, because they do," he shouted above the declang of iron on flint. Behind them, in the town of Gettysburg, civilians pressed into cellars, ears straining at every distant rumble. Elizabeth Salter held her youngest to her breast, counting the seconds between blasts, praying the walls would hold. Outside, stray dogs nosed among overturned market stalls, sniffing blood already dry on cobblestones. On the Confederate left, soldiers of Hood's and McLaws divisions stacked arms and tried to sleep, bayonets catching starlight. Yet few could close their eyes. The smell of powder still clung to their uniforms like an omen. A young Georgia private wrote by fireglow, "We feel this is no common fight. The whole rebellion turns on tomorrow." Midnight passed. Artillery drivers watered horses at a creek turned copper by torchlight. Far to the north, a locomotive whistle wailed. More Union troops coming down the Northern Central Railroad. Lee heard it too, a thin iron cry carried on the wind and tightened the cinch on tomorrow's gamble. In the pre-dawn hush, pickets on both ridges watched each other's fires die to coals. Somewhere, a solitary drum began a slow, muffled beat. 3 strokes, then silence. Every man who heard it understood the signal. The lull was ending. The hurricane would break with the sun. The sun had climbed halfway to noon when the first Confederate guns opened on the Union left. James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted lieutenant, had spent the morning maneuvering his corps through the tangled woods and ridges south of Gettysburg. Every minute that passed felt like betrayal. Lee had ordered the attack for dawn, yet here it was, past 4 in the afternoon, and the assault columns were still forming. The target was the Union left flank, anchored on a rocky hill called Little Round Top. From its crest, the entire Federal position lay exposed like an opened map. If Longstreet could seize it, the Army of the Potomac would be rolled up like a carpet. Down below, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine held the extreme left of the Union line. His regiment had marched all night, reaching the hill just as Confederate skirmishers appeared in the woods below. 400 men, outnumbered 3-1, with orders to hold at all costs. The first Confederate wave hit like a hammer. Alabamans and Texans, screaming the rebel yell, clawed their way up the slope. Chamberlain's men poured volley after volley into their ranks, but still they came. The hill rang with the clash of steel as the lines met at the crest. Meanwhile, 300 yards north, Devil's Den erupted in chaos. John Bell Hood's Texans had found a path through the tangled ravines and now fought hand to hand among the granite outcrops. The fighting was so close that men clubbed each other with rifle butts and threw rocks when ammunition ran out. The peach orchard became a slaughterhouse. Union General Sickles had advanced his corps too far forward, creating a vulnerable salient. Confederate artillery tore gaping holes in the blue line. The wheat field changed hands 5 times in as many hours. Men fought across ground so covered with dead that they walked on corpses. By 6 o'clock, Chamberlain's ammunition was gone. His men had held for 90 minutes against repeated assaults. Now, the Confederates were forming for another charge up the slope. Chamberlain made the desperate decision that would echo through history. "Fix bayonets!" The order ran down the line like wildfire. "Charge!" The 20th Maine swept down the hill like an avalanche. The Confederates, exhausted and expecting an easy victory, broke before the unexpected assault. As dusk settled across the battlefield, Lee watched from Seminary Ridge. His plan had failed. The Union left still held. Yet in the gathering darkness, he saw something else. The center of Meade's line looked thin, stretched, vulnerable. One more push, he believed, and the war might end tomorrow. The day had cost both armies 17,000 casualties. The rocky hills and tangled woods south of Gettysburg had become a charnel house. But as the fires died down and the wounded cried for water, both sides knew the worst was yet to come. Tomorrow would bring Pickett's Charge, and the fate of America would hang in the balance. Twilight on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge. The sun hung low, a copper disk sliding behind South Mountain, when General Robert E. Lee's last fresh corps prepared to strike. In the oppressive heat of July 2nd, 1863, the air itself seemed to pulse with the drumbeat of approaching doom. Across the valley, Union Commander George Gordon Meade peered through field glasses, watching the gray tide begin its crawl toward Culp's Hill. 7 o'clock. The moment had come. General Richard Ewell's guns barked first, sending solid shots screaming across the smoky dusk toward the Union batteries, dug in along East Cemetery Hill. The reply was instantaneous. Union cannons loaded with double-shotted canister, each blast spraying hundreds of iron balls like a giant shotgun. The hillside cemetery transformed into a nightmare of flickering light and shadow. Each cannon flash froze the charging Confederates in stark silhouette, their bayonets gleaming like teeth before darkness swallowed them again. Among the tombstones of Pennsylvania Germans long dead, living men screamed and died, their blood soaking soil already consecrated by generations. On Culp's Hill's lower slopes, the 1st Maryland Battalion, many wearing Union blue only months earlier, led the assault.
They clawed upward through tangled laurel and chest-high boulders, every foot gained, measured in lives.
Union Colonel Samuel Carroll's brigade met them with point-blank volleys that cut the front rank to pieces. The fighting dissolved into chaos. Men grappled in the darkness, stumbling over bodies, firing at shadows. A Confederate captain fell across a Union grave, his blood pooling on the carved words, "Rest in peace." The irony was lost on no one.
By 9 o'clock, East Cemetery Hill blazed like a volcano. Union General Winfield Scott Hancock rode along the ridge,
Rallying gun crews even as Confederate bullets whined past his ears. "Hold this ground," he shouted above the din. "By God, hold it!" The Confederate tide reached the crest, but could advance no further. Union reinforcements poured up the slope, bayonets fixed, their faces grim masks in the moonlight. For 20 minutes, the hilltop became a butcher's yard, men killing and dying among burning caissons and screaming horses. Then, gradually, the firing slackened. Both sides, exhausted beyond reason, pulled back to reform their shattered lines. The wounded cried for water from both armies, their voices rising in a terrible chorus across the darkened hills. By midnight, an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield. The only sounds were the moans of the dying and the distant creak of artillery being repositioned. Officers moved through their commands, counting losses by lantern light. The numbers were staggering, thousands more added to the day's butcher's bill. On Cemetery Ridge, Union soldiers stood to their guns, staring west into the darkness where Lee's army waited. They knew what dawn would bring. Behind them, Gettysburg itself lay in ruins. Churches turned to hospitals, homes to morgues. The night air hung thick with the smell of burnt gunpowder and death. Men wrote final letters by candlelight, many knowing these would be their last words. Others simply stared into the darkness, waiting for the sun that would bring Pickett's Charge, and with it, the fate of America itself. The 3rd of July, 1863, dawned already scorched. A brassy heat rose from the Pennsylvania clay before the sun itself appeared, as though the earth itself dreaded what the morning would demand. On Seminary Ridge, 1 mile due west, 17 score Confederate guns squatted wheel to wheel, iron snouts aligned along the crest like the bared teeth of some colossal beast. Robert E. Lee had ridden the line before sunrise, gray coat unbuttoned, white-bearded face impassive, despite the fever that had dogged him since the Rapidan. He spoke softly to each battery commander, reminding them that the fate of the Confederacy itself would ride upon the weight of their shot. Few words were needed. The gunners understood what 3 days of frustration had prepared them to do. James Longstreet accompanied the commanding general, but every step of his big sorrel brought fresh torment to the burly lieutenant general. He had argued again the night before that the attack should be shifted to the Union right, where the ground offered cover and the enemy flank might still be turned. Lee had listened, then quietly replied, "The enemy is there, General, and I am going to strike him." Longstreet had saluted, yet his heart sank like a stone in a well. Across the valley, Winfield Scott Hancock walked the Union line he had held through 2 nights of horror. He had already ordered every gun on Cemetery Ridge double-shotted with canister and shell, the front line of cannon depressed so their muzzles pointed directly at the gentle swale across which the Confederates must come. Behind the guns, blue-clad infantry crouched behind low stone walls or shallow rifle pits, each man silently calculating the distance to the Emmitsburg Road and the rail fence beyond. A few wrote quick notes to mothers or sweethearts, pressing the folded paper into the hands of stretcher-bearers who might survive the day. Others simply stared across the valley, watching the glint of Confederate bayonets as the enemy formed in perfect parade ground order. In a shallow ravine behind the guns, surgeons set up the last of their field hospitals. Kettles of water boiled over small fires, the steam mixing with the sweet stench of chloroform and the iron tang of blood. Chaplains moved among the wounded who had survived the night, murmuring prayers in English and German and Irish brogues. Every man sensed that the quiet was unnatural, the hush before the storm more terrifying than the storm itself. George Pickett, flamboyant as ever, rode along the front of his division with a rose between his teeth, though the bloom had wilted in the heat. His 3 brigades, Kemper's, Garnett's, and Armistead's, stretched across the ridge in perfect alignment, 15,000 men who had never yet failed their commander. Pickett's staff carried bottles of medicinal brandy, passing them among the colonels who would lead the charge. Every soldier knew the mathematics. A mile of open ground, uphill, against double-shotted cannon and massed infantry. Yet discipline held, pride held, and the terrible beauty of military order stretched across the ridge like a drawn bowstring. At 20 minutes past 8, the last courier rode away. Orders had been given. There was nothing left to do but wait for the signal gun. The sun climbed higher, brassy and merciless. In the valley between the armies, a single crow flapped lazily above the wheat stubble, cawing once before wheeling away toward the town. Somewhere a church bell tolled the hour, the sound thin and metallic across the heat-shimmering air. Every man on both ridges felt the same suffocating certainty. Whatever happened next would carve its memory into American hearts forever. And still the guns waited, silent, hungry, 17 score iron mouths open to the sky. 1 o'clock in the afternoon, July 3rd, 1863. A hush falls across the ridges, so complete a dropped canteen would clang like a church bell. Then, with the suddenness of thunder born inside the earth itself, 170 Confederate guns roar as one. The concussion slams chests 3 miles away. Union cannoneers crouch behind breastworks, counting heartbeats between blasts. For 2 relentless hours, solid iron screams overhead, searching for flesh, finding only earth and sky. Then, at 3 o'clock, the guns fall silent so abruptly, the silence hurts. Out of the white wall, 12,500 men of George Pickett's division step into perfect alignment, battle flags unfurling like crimson wings. Colonel Edward Porter Alexander has given the signal. If the artillery preparation has done its work, advance. General James Longstreet watches with the face of a man attending his own funeral, unable to speak the order he knows will break the Army of Northern Virginia in half. Pickett, golden hair gleaming, waves his plumed hat and cries, "Forward, men, for Old Virginia!" The line moves at parade pace, drums silent, only the rhythmic tramp of 12,000 boots upon Pennsylvania sod. Half a mile, a quarter mile, then every Federal battery fires at once. Canister, tin cans packed with iron balls, turns the air into a storm of metal. Still they come, closing gaps, colors rising again. Richard Garnett rides with sword reversed like a marshal of the dead, knowing he will not survive the day. James Kemper's Virginians angle left toward the copse of trees. Lewis Armistead, black hat raised on sword, leads the final rush, crying, "Give 'em the cold steel, boys." For one impossible moment, the Confederacy reaches its high-water mark. Then the wall erupts with musketry at 10 paces. Armistead falls beside the guns he has captured, hand outstretched toward his dying men. In 45 minutes, Pickett's division loses 2/3 of its strength. George Pickett rides back sobbing, unable to look behind him. Robert E. Lee meets the survivors, voice breaking. "It is all my fault." The flags that cross the valley lie trampled in the grass. Smoke drifts across the field like the ghosts of 12,000 dreams. In that drifting silence, the fate of America turns, forever, toward Union. Morning, July 4th. A soft, soaking rain begins to fall over Gettysburg, turning powder smoke to thin gray mud. Every hollow echoes with the lowing of wounded cattle and the far-off rumble of wagons. Robert E. Lee's army, once the proud spear of rebellion, now crawls toward the Potomac in silent columns. George Gordon Meade, slumped in a canvas chair outside his tent, listens to the rain drum on the awning and does nothing. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln paces the telegraph office, waiting for word of pursuit that never comes. He will later write that the war was won at Gettysburg and lost at the Potomac. The town of Gettysburg wakes to find the war still in its streets. 7,000 bodies lie where they fell, their faces already turning the color of old candle wax. 30,000 wounded grown in every barn, church, and home. The smell of chloroform mixes with the smell of summer rain. Into this charnel house steps Matthew Brady, carrying his bulky glass plate camera. He moves like a priest among the fallen, recording what words cannot. When his photographs reach New York 3 weeks later, Harper's Weekly warns readers to look away, yet they cannot. For the first time, the nation sees the true price of union. 4 months pass. The leaves turn, fall, and return to earth. On November 19th, a train pulls into Gettysburg, carrying a tall, weary president. He rides a horse whose legs are still crusted with battlefield mud. At the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, he rises and speaks for 2 minutes. He begins with a phrase that will outlive every cannon. 77 years ago. In those few sentences, he redefines the war from a struggle for union to a crusade for equality. When he finishes, the crowd is silent, unsure whether to applaud or prayer. Today, the ridge is quiet. The guns are rust in museums, the blood long washed away by rain. Yet every stone still asks the same question, whether any nation conceived in liberty can long endure. The union saved here still stands, wounded but unbroken. And so the unfinished work continues, in every generation that dares to add its own brave verse to the enduring promise.